without further ado, tonight I am very excited to welcome Professor Emeritus George Holley to speak on Inset Valleys, the key to unlocking the Red River Valley story. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to George. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I want to thank the Minnesota Archaeological Society for inviting me to do this. It's fun, at least from my perspective, to share the information based on my research over the years. First, background to the story. We have to go to the northwestern part of the state and go back in time to the Pleistocene. And while our story doesn't begin in the Pleistocene, what created it does. And you're looking at glacial Lake Agassiz, and we're going to focus on the southern part of glacial Lake Agassiz, which when it drained anywhere from 8 to 7,000 BC, it left behind a basin here that was fairly long, at least in the United States, 190 miles, 30 miles wide. And in this basin, the Red River eventually was formed and flowing north into Hudson Bay. What inset valleys are, at least for our concern, are these rivers that cut into the strand lines or beach ridges of Lake Agassiz. So you can see there's about 12 a baker's dozen on each side of the river, on the North Dakota side and the Minnesota side. These valleys cut into the strand lines and create unique environments, which I'll detail. Now, these strand lines, there are a number of them. They're all lined up in this slide from Upham, which shows the various beach ridges as they, as Lake Agassiz moved back and forth, receded, and eventually drained out. Now, because it's a glacial lake, archaeologists early on thought it might be a great place to study so-called glacial man. Jenks was the first to push this idea, and he did uncover, or did eventually excavate, a terminal paleo occupation, or a burial, and other burials he found in the region, another burial. But essentially, he did not find any occupation, any significant sites that he could tie into so-called glacial man. Now, Lloyd Wilford followed in the Red River Valley, although he concentrated on burial mounds, which you see here lined up along the Red River, or parallel to the Red River. And I'm going to come back to this because all of these mounds are positioned at inset valleys, which is very important, of course. Wilford did not excavate any site that was beyond a burial mound in the Red River Valley. It wasn't until Johnson, until we get someone actually excavating sites, or what you consider standard archaeological sites. And Johnson got an NSF grant in the 60s to study, he thought, or he hoped, early human occupants of the Red River Valley, or at least glacial Lake Agassiz. He dug a number of sites in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and he failed to find anything early. And basically, archaeology in the Red River Valley grew moribund after this. Nobody was there, nobody was interested in it. Johnson did excavate one site in the valley itself, in the northern part of the valley, and it was a black duck bison processing site. And he reasoned, based on this, that there wasn't much archaeology in the valley, and that people from the east, the lakes country, would come to the valley to hunt. So it's basically a hunting refuge. At least that was the idea. Mike McLovick arrived at what was then Moorhead State University, now Minnesota State University, Moorhead, and he conducted research and contract mitigation in the Red River Valley, and basically opened up our eyes to a considerable long depth of occupation. Mike was able to dig in soils that most people thought couldn't be dug in, and we'll be talking about some of his work here tonight. I have this slide in to remind me, I used to use it in talking about forgeries in archaeology. This is an obvious forgery, but because of bison hunting, and we go back to Johnson, who felt that the area was simply used for hunting bison, Bison hunting is the most important activity throughout the past in the occupation of the Red River Valley. It is not the only subsistence activity, but it is a primary one and a fundamental one. Let me give you a sort of the big picture of the Red River Valley, sort of a overview of the prehistory, and then I'll go into my work at Inset Valleys and then plug it back into this overview of the Red River Valley. First, as I said, we have some terminal paleo scattered about. Mike found a site in the valley proper. There are also some sites in Canada, but you couldn't say that we have a significant terminal paleo occupation anywhere in the valley. Archaic occupations are found, and when they're found and they're good sites, they're buried in various situations, which I'll talk about. But there are not very many of them. All other non-buried archaic sites are simply lithic scatters with a few points here and there. When we move into initial woodland, the same conditions prevail. That is, we find decent buried sites. Surface sites don't seem to be as important. And by the time we get into late woodland, we have, in contrast to other places in the United States, not a population explosion, if you will, but rather an odd and sketchy occupation, which I'll talk about later. By the time we get to the late pre-contact, after 1200 or so, we have an immense, an outstanding, if you will, a shocking display of archaeological sites all along the margins of the Red River. In the central part, basically every bend of the river, there is an archaeological site that has late pre-contact material on it. It's an occupation that we can't overemphasize. Now, the term Inset Valley was given to me by Gary Running, and Gary Running really gave the meat to this work in the on the question of inset valleys. It's kind of odd because I haven't defined inset valleys yet. I will, but most of our research was initiated not to deal with inset valleys. It was simply to do archaeology in a regional science center, which I'll detail. But Gary Running gave us eyes to see the geomorphological processes and therefore to understand the settings for our sites. Now, here's the cartoon version of the Inset Valley. I mentioned we have the Red River, which would have been timbered. We have what is called the Red River Valley, but it's basically the bottom of Lake Agassiz. And then we have the beach ridges. And then as we move further east, we get into sort of hummocky moraines with depressions and some prairie lakes. And eventually it goes to the ecotone, and then eventually further east, we have the forested areas of central Minnesota. If you notice the blue color here, and it's yellow here just to distinguish, but this would have all been prairie except for the Red River Channel and for large parts of the beach ridge here. What we have is these beach ridges are protected, or the inset valleys protected the timber from burning because they're well set into, and so the fires couldn't easily reach it. So it's essentially an oasis. Here is a reconstruction of the GLO for the area we're working at, and you can see timber along the river, and that's pretty much it. The strand lines are easy to find. The valley itself is flat, and they do stand out when you see them. Now, the area I worked in is called the Regional Science Center of Minnesota State University Moorhead. It's a 400-acre tract that the university has to, do science things on. And archaeology is one of those science things. If you notice where it's located, where it's ideally positioned for us, here is the valley itself. And here is the Buffalo River running through it. This is a LiDAR map of Clay County. And here is our hummocky moraines. And the Science Center is on the Buffalo River right as before it enters into the valley itself. So it's an inset valley. The river itself is fordable most of the year. In some places it might be called a creek, but I don't know, does Minnesota use the word creek much? But anyway, this is a Buffalo River. It offers till rock, which the river exposes, of course, water and timber. And along the margins of the Inset Valley, which are sloping anywhere from 30 to 70 feet in elevation above the floodplain. You can have luxuriant shade vegetation. And that is, I would believe, to be the most significant resource base. Problem we have as archaeologists is that most of this vegetation that would be usable for medicinal or nutritional purposes doesn't char and doesn't end up in the archaeological deposit. It's a shame, but we know ethnohistorically and ethnographically that there are a number of plants usable, and the shade vegetation exists nowhere else in the environment surrounding it. It's even in parts of the floodplain. Once you get to the top of the Inset Valley on the margins, you'll see the bur oak trees here, but then you have the expansive prairie, which stretches out for miles and miles. One of my favorite places to be at the Regional Science Center. A LiDAR map shows these geomorphological features. All the red here are the beach strand lines. Some of them are discernible, the others have been sort of worn over by the river, by glacial Lake Agassiz moving back and forth. The principal landforms are the floodplain and the uplands, or the sand ridges themselves. So we have basically two major environments here to sample and study. Now, inset valleys were known in the past to be important. This is a survey that Mike conducted in the 1970s of Clay County. It was part of a statewide project. Clay County was selected as one of the counties to survey to develop a predictive model for where sites exist. And so the county was stratified into 4 zones. You see here sampling strata, river or streams, which includes the Red River and the Buffalo River, the beach ridges, stream dissecting beach ridge, which we're calling Inset Valley, and then prairie. It should be of no surprise that most of the sites were found on the river or streams and the stream dissecting beach ridge, or Inset Valley. Stream dissecting beach ridge is a kind of god-awful. You know, when I think about these survey projects, and they were done all across the United States, the predictive model project. When I was in graduate school in the late 70s, at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, they also conducted one of these projects, except in this case, they took all of Southern Illinois and they gathered all of the archaeological data on this in site forms, and using punch cards, which, oh my goodness, a bane of people working at the time. Anyway, they crunched all the site data, and they found that the best predictive indicator of a site was a cultivated field. Mike did excavate one site in the Science Center, and that was 21 CY 39, which is a black duck site, and he found rather intensive occupation and a lot of evidence for processing bison. Mike's strategy of excavating sites is different than mine, and both are important, I think. Mike likes to find a good site and sit there for a couple of seasons, and as he says, by the time you get finished, you realize, hey, I got a lot of stuff here. And it's right, he did get a lot of stuff from this site. My strategy is to find a site, find the good spot of the site, dig it, then go to the next one, and then the next one, and next one. I guess I'm greedy, but Mike's excavation strategy was important because it gave us an insight into what the archaeology of this Science Center was about, at least on the bluff top. And you see the tree line in this photo is the bluff edge, and then notice the rodent burrows. So it gave us a great view of what archaeology would look like here. And here's his map from the site. You can see the floodplain in green and the white representing the bluff top. So we started to work there in 2014, and our idea was simply to work from known to the unknown. And we're trying to introduce students to how to do archaeology, principally shovel testing, because there are no cultivated fields within the Science Center. There's only prairie grass and forest. This photo reminds me of, this is summer in the Northwest. I invited a friend one year to help Mike and I at a field school in North Dakota, and he said it was the coldest season he ever experienced in archaeology. I continued with this, just using Mike's site and going from and spreading out in other directions, and eventually found in the following fall in 2014 of in using a class in methods and theory, found a buried archaic site, which was generated press. It was a good story, and everybody seemed to be interested in it, and generated enthusiasm in the Science Center. But the real kick to my study here was the grant received by the university, by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, to restore prairie and floodplain forest vegetation. And the reasoning was that since they were going to involve some land manipulation, that they should know about the archaeology. So we set about trying to shovel test large areas of the Science Center. And that gave us a nice sample, and we began to realize that sites were present and really everywhere, nearly everywhere we worked. And we started to wonder, why are there all these sites here? Eventually it morphed into field schools, and we ended, the last one was in 2020. You can see the COVID masks. It has been done, and sometimes it involved just myself out walking the grasslands, but it was helpful. It was good for students, we think, and it gave us a lot of information. Here's a distribution map of the sites we found. There are 27 of them. We didn't find all 27. Mike had found some previously, but you can see it's an impressive display of sites. Now there isn't an artifact at underneath every gray blob here, but it is a very interesting array in the floodplain and in the bluff edge. And here is Mike's site that he tested, and that's my buried archaic site, which I'll get into. 1,325 shovel tests, about 30% were positive. As I said, we found sites in the bluff top and in the floodplain. The floodplain was primarily characterized by bone, bison bone. So there's a lot of killing and processing of bison in the floodplain. In the bluff tops, bison bone is present, but it's less common. This map is misleading because we were able to find artifacts on the surface, intensively working, varied conditions, controlled burns, rodent burrows, drought years, early spring. You could see some material on the surface. So we were able to expand that shovel tested control area. And in addition, we tested 9 sites. I finished a report with the aid of all of these people, professionals like Gary Running and Mike McLobick and Rebecca Dean and Renita Dalen, and the geologist Carl Leonard, but also quite a lot of students. The sequence that I derived from this work and other work in the central part of the Red River Valley, it's pretty elaborate. I'm not going to go over it. But it's important to realize that basically from early archaic times into late pre-contact, there's evidence for all of this occupation in the Science Center. I'll briefly go through the sequence. The archaic sites in red here. The floodplain archaic sites are buried and relatively rich. The upland sites are diffuse with a few points and lithic scatters. The one I mentioned we found in 2014 with a class is located next to the Red River. It is aeolian buildup. It's not overbank deposition. You can see the sand ramping up along the edge of the bluff. I should mention that the Science Center at one time was a large golf course. In fact, large areas of it were in a golf course, and here's some modification. I'll show you occasionally in LiDAR, you'll see the modification. But now this site is right next to the river. All of this, about 6 to 7 feet of this, is all windblown settlements, primarily at the base. There's some overbank deposition, and it has buried archaic occupations. It is a dune field, and because it's a dune field, it's difficult to dig and expect uniformity from one excavation unit to another. For example, in one excavation unit, I would excavate and find going down about close to 6 feet, 2 buried horizons. And a nearby unit, only 1 buried horizon, and a little further away, no buried horizons. Nevertheless, in these units with the buried horizons, we had some stratigraphy. And also, by the way, this buried horizon, which you can see one of them here, had no correlation with the archaeology. In other words, artifact density had nothing to do with the buried horizon. The richest level, which was in here, where I got a radiocarbon date for dating to the early, to the middle Archaic, the Plains Middle Archaic, was fairly rich, and it was well above the buried horizon. Closer to the bottom, I found a point that is similar to what Mike found in the North Dakota at early Plains Archaic. And then up above, we have a basant, which is probably late Archaic or early initial woodland, excuse me. A lot of evidence for bison processing. We floated a lot here, but not one little fleck of charcoal. The only thing I thought might be charcoal turned out to be charred bone. Very disappointing. We have sort of a pavement of rock found in one. That obviously there's burning going on here. There's firecracked rock, there's burned bone, there's spalled chert, but alas, no charcoal, because I was hoping to know what the wood was like at that time. The other archaic site is a little to the east, and here we see the evidence for the golf course. These are runways for the ancient astronauts, or fairways and greens, and borrowing and land modification, which is, it destroyed a number of sites, or at least parts of sites. But this is a remnant, a landform that the river had cut off. And on this one, we found a buried archaic site. The borrow pit that the golf course dug in for fill left an exposed a profile, which geomorphologists and geologists continued to work and gave them a nice sequence of development for Aeolian buildup. Reason why we were interested in it is because Mike found an archaic point eroding out of this borrow edge. We dug on the top and found about 60 centimeters below surface, a archaic occupation. There's an archaic occupation above it, but it's sort of mixed with woodland and it's not as rich. This one was fairly rich. We found a number of points, tools, rock and the like. Interesting that in contrast to the other archaic occupation, which was primarily early and middle, we had a lot of knife river flint there. Here, hardly any knife river flint. What I'm trying to say is we really don't understand what's going on with the archaic. Oh, you can see a visible reminder of the landscape modification. This is a beautiful stratigraphic picture, but yet what it reveals is a stripping of the topsoil, which is we get the bottom of the A horizon here, and then fill on top of it. This is from much deeper sediments, well below this, that were taken from a borrow pit nearby. There is a late woodland occupation right below here, and we missed it, the top of it. It's been stripped away. We move to the initial woodland, and again, a floodplain focus. That's where we find the best evidence for it. And two sites in particular I'll talk about, which are on a narrow ledge of a floodplain that the river is next to it, and it's next to the bluff. So it's sort of sandwiched between. This is where all the ferns are growing. Again, Aeolian sand buildup. We do have some colluvial and alluvial deposition here. We have initial woodland going down to about 1 meter, but not a lot of material, it's sparse. The initial woodland we found here, although it isn't characteristic of all initial woodland in the valley, is like Elk Lake complex. It has net impressed pottery and horizontal cordage and thick walls. The other woodland site we dug in this area also had, this one had a buried A horizon with no association with archaeological material. And again, when we found here a larger number of subsequent occupations extending into the late pre-contact. This site is on the edge, the margins of the valley, and this is a schematic map that Gary Running made. This is the channel itself. The river, the Buffalo River, is Gary would call a wimpy river that doesn't really have the oomph to move around and go deeper, because the till has sort of provided an armor plated a base to the river movement, or at least the river going deeper. So what you have is simply the river moves around sand over time. It doesn't move greatly. Gary Running noticed that in the aerial photographs that the river hardly moved at all. You know, in contrast to other places in the Midwest, when you can have up to 2 meters of deposition because of erosion and farming, there's very little of that here at all. Partly this river system is, you know, fine starved, as Gary Running would say. It's mostly just sand, and it's very little of that in terms of deposition. But these woodland sites are on the margins, and they have sort of a combination of all, you know, a colluvium, alluvium, and aeolian deposition. As I mentioned, there's other woodland there. There's St. Croix stamped, which is sort of a transitional late woodland. A fascinating time. We find this kind of material scattered all over the Red River Valley in the south and the central area, and even into eastern North Dakota. But it's always just a few sherds here and there. It's very interesting, but we know very little about it. Late woodland is when we have the, if you will, population explosion, at least in terms of number of sites that we can identify in time period. And we have late woodland occupations on the bluff tops and in the floodplain. That Mike site, 21C/39, is one of these late woodland sites. He identified it as black duck, and it has, you know, striations and cord wrap stick punctations and wedge rims. But there's some other stuff here that is different. And so it might be best characterized as sort of a southern black duck. I've also pulled out material that I think is affiliated with Cathio more, and it's called the Wolverton phase. And it's different from black duck, maybe later. So we began to talk about developing models for understanding this late woodland, because we had late woodland on bluff tops, and they seem to be different kinds of sites. In other words, diversity, and in the floodplain. Let me look at the bluff top, talk about that first briefly. And I worked on these models with students, Jack Carr and Carly DeSanto. And we came up with 3 basic models for this bluff top occupation. There is the Model A, which is the intensive one, Model B, less intensive, and Model C, ephemeral. I'll show you what we think about them graphically. The idea was that this Model A occupation represented a sort of a base camp in a traditional notion of one. It has a center, if you will, where you find all the artifacts produced by the society, the culture at the time, and then a lot of material, and it has features. And as you move away from there, you find some artifacts present, but they're scattered about. So the idea is that most activities that people interacting and doing things in concert is concentrated, and these spurious finds either represent later or earlier short-term occupations, or just sort of backdrop use of the land. The Model B, where we'd have most of these artifacts present, but instead of the rich hot spots, if you will, they were just sort of a concentration of some late woodland artifacts. And we think this clearly represents not an organization of the use, or the use of the site as by a group of people, but rather a smaller group who are using it less intensively, and then returning and returning. And finally, even more ephemeral, is a very short term, this Model C, where you just get a few artifacts present. When I was thinking about this, I realized it could be graphically or shown by photographs of excavating these areas. Here you're looking at Mike's excavations of his hotspot, that center I was talking about. And notice archaeologists are in close contact. They could talk to one another. This is what I imagine the site would have been like when it was occupied, people working together in a small area. And the Model B sites, on the other hand, and here you see the actual displacement of a distribution of archaeologists digging up areas of concentration at this one site. And obviously these people can't even talk to one another without yelling, and they're not working in concert. So obviously, I think, and this I think shows it very well, that this kind of Model B site really represents just small groups coming to the area a very short time and then moving on and not working in concert. For the floodplain, it's a more complicated story because we have quite a lot of occupation in the floodplain that we have some evidence for, but I'm just dealing with the late woodland and what I think is going on there. And for late woodland, we have possibly winter occupation. Winter occupation of the valley floors are well known ethnohistorically. And anyone who's been in these areas, as I've been, when it's sub-zero temperatures, you feel a difference when you get into the valley because the wind doesn't hit you as hard. So winter occupation, and then these are more bison processing and kill sites, which we have woodland pottery at. And then we have these two woodland sites that I keep mentioning. It has initial woodland and later woodland. Here we have bison, but we also have evidence for fish, birds, small mammals, deer. So it's more generalized. And I think it's a different season than all of these and different activities in these bison processings or winter kill sites. So there is some, in late woodland time, some orchestration of people living on the bluff tops and in the floodplain, and not the case in initial woodland. Now, we do have lake pre-contact, and that includes Sandy Lake and Northeast Plains Village, but it represents roughly a few sherds. There's only one place down here in the floodplain that may represent a winter occupation where we have enough ceramics in an area of about 100 meters where it's probably indicating something different. The pottery is very small. This is a Northeast Plains smooth plain with broad incising. Can't say much about the late pre-contact. It is, in contrast to the Red River Valley, the weakest representative of the prehistoric periods. So in short, we have the entire sequence here after 6,500 BC in a relatively small area, 400 acres. Why? Well, I can't say enough about how big of a deal this is first. I have been involved in a number of surveys in the region, and to find one site is good, but to find so many sites is basically unexpected. I took an example of a lake in the forested areas, well to the east of us, and this was a lake that DNR was able to survey most of it. And you notice there's sites everywhere, just like ours, except there are 10,000 lakes in Minnesota, and there aren't 10,000 inset valleys. But nevertheless, the inset valleys are really the place where you get more bang for your buck in a small area in the Red River Valley. Now, why is that? I mentioned it's a unique habitat. I think essentially an oasis, offering resources that are not available nearby. Southwestern archaeologists came up with a term which I liked, and that was a persistent place, because they're confronted in some areas of the Southwest, just like we are, with all of these sites covering a large time period, big time span. And they argued that it's persistently occupied because each group tends to do something that sets the land to be, offering resources for future groups. So they may not be doing it intentionally, but their modifications help. And I don't think that applies here, because I think that the archaeology seems to show that people are doing different things throughout time. And I don't see any sort of persistence in that respect. They're only persistently there because of the resources. So let me sum it up with plugging what we found in the Inset Valley with our evolving understanding. The archaic, I'm not going to talk about because we can't say much about, except that people are moving about hunting bison, fitting the caricature of Red River Valley. I think that changes in initial woodland. And I've drawn this line here to represent a cultural affiliation. To the north, we have laurel. When you find initial woodland in the valley, it's associated with laurel. And when you find it further south, it has this mishmash of cultures, which has Elk Lake, Malmo, Avonlea, which we have called Danke and Kent. And we'll go into elaboration on that. But it is important that you can see this division, and also, which carries on later, and also that I think it's the founder effect because I mentioned earlier this map of Wilfrid's mounds that he excavated in the Red River Valley. All of these mounds are on inset valleys. So every inset valley is important. There's a mound on the Buffalo River Science Center inset valley, but it's off of the property. So all of these mounds are here. They're at the ideal position, that is the inset valley. And all of the ceramics I was able to look at for these sites, all of them, if there's ceramics there, have initial woodland. Now, I'm not saying that initial woodlands built the mounds. I am saying that they started the use of this area and use of these mounds and use of the landform, probably as gathering places, which continue to be used until the late pre-contact occupation. By black duck times or late woodland times, things change. I mentioned that in the valley itself, there's very little black duck. Now, Johnson excavated a site that had black duck occupation, bison processing. There's some in Kitson County, black duck bison processing. But as we move further south, we don't get these kinds of sites in the valley itself. In fact, they are on the margins. These inset valleys is where you find the black duck. And I can use evidence from eastern North Dakota, analysis of cores from lakes in eastern North Dakota reveal droughts during important parts, beginning and end of black duck occupation. So I'm suggesting that these droughts impacted people moving about the land. Why go westward if you're not sure you're going to have water at the end of 2 days of walking? So I think it constrained the people to the edge of the valley itself so they could use the valley, but not going further into the west. And that seems to be borne out by the archaeology we have seen of eastern North Dakota with very little black duck. I want to bring up an idea that we are developing with, and that is, and black duck's a good time to bring it up, in that perhaps in the north, at least in black duck time, people are coming from Lakes Country to the east and going to the west. But I think in the south, where you have this mishmash, we saw it earlier with initial woodland, and we see it with the late woodland as well, of different kinds of ceramics. I think these are indigenous people and moving seasonal rounds, taking advantage of the prairie lakes, the river, and the inset valleys, and moving about the land, and not masses of people coming from lakes to hunt bison. By the time in late pre-contact, I mentioned that the valley is flooded with archaeological sites, and the lineup here, Sandy Lake, Northeast Plains Village, and Oneota, doesn't reflect necessarily how people are spread out, but it is an amalgam of all of these different kinds of cultural groups coming together and living and doing. Fascinating, but we're not quite sure what they're doing in the Red River Valley. I think inset valleys are the key because they're chock full of resources in a relatively small area. You can survey river upon mile of rivers, these tributary rivers, and find a few sites. So you'd spend all your time there, where you can get the whole picture, if you will, of an important part of the story at just a small area of these inset valleys. Let me show you what little archaeology we do have of other inset valleys, how important they are. If we go in the north in Kitson County, here is Lake Bronson State Park, which is on an inset valley. There is the Lake Bronson mounds, multiple mounds. And whenever a DNR does a survey of this for construction or the like, they find an archaeological site. So I would guess that if they surveyed the whole land like we did at the Science Center, it would be chock full of sites as well. The Middle River, Marshall County, look at the concentration of sites along the Inset Valley. And lastly, the Orwell site in Otter Tail River in Otter Tail County. Here is the Inset Valley. Here's the end of the beach ridges, and look at all the mounds in the floodplain and the bluff top. So to end it all, I think inset valleys have an important role to understanding this massive Red River Valley and how it was used through time. You know, the Red River Valley is the size of a small New England state. And I think now we only have one archaeologist working in that whole area, sort of like Rhode Island having only one archaeologist, which boggles the mind. So we're going to have to make the best of what we have. And the way to make the best of what we have is to start focusing on the inset valleys. We don't know if each inset valley has a different story, but I'm sure that that story is going to be important and will help us further put the keys together with what's going on in the main valley itself. I think that everywhere in the state, there are inset valleys, and I mean that in quotes, inset valleys, meaning places where people gathered, where people lingered, that were important for transportation. And we need to find those, as opposed to examining a county or landform as being a blank slate where people could live anywhere. That's not the case. We need to be more precise and concentrate more on finding these spaces, these oases, and concentrate on them, and we'll get rewarded for them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I have a few questions that I've had come in. So a couple of the questions. First one I want to ask is, can you give us a specific definition of what an inset valley is? What are the key characteristics to define one?
Great question. I asked Gary that myself. And what I get is, well, you know, Insides Valley doesn't really quite get at what's going on there. I like the term, but whether, you know, I'll have to get Gary on to give some precise sort of, you know, a precise definition of it. I think he likes it because it's not incised valley. How's that? It's inset into the beach ridges. How's that?
Okay, so like with that LiDAR image where it kind of looked like the river was kind of swooping into like the land ridges, that would be a characteristic people could identify an inset valley with.
Yeah, well, it's easy to find an inset valley. You can find it by walking, by riding, by looking at a LiDAR map. They're pretty obvious. And actually, we have all of the beach ridges mapped, so it's cookie cutter. I mean, it's really easy. I say that now, but when I started the project, I didn't necessarily think they were so special. I just thought they were another river valley.
Yeah, definitely a newer term to me too. So I'm excited to learn a little more about that.
Yeah, so am I. I'll blame it on Gary. Yeah, they're cutting down through the sand, you know, but rivers cut down everywhere. Anyway.
Well, that's a good segue into another question we had, focused on some of those sites at the Science Center, the Science Research Center. So the question is, how did site preservation in the floodplain compare to the bluff-top sites? Did you see a lot of erosion at the river sites? I know you mentioned maybe not quite as much soil deposits coming from the river, but did you notice any site erosion there?
Well, you know, the river has destroyed sites, obviously, which we know nothing about. Erosion is not a factor as much. Even on the bluff edges, the bluffs don't seem to erode significantly. It's remarkably, given that it's sands and silts, remarkably not something that we find a lot of extensive erosion.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. Another question was, so also kind of related to that same work, how deep were the shovel probes that were being excavated there, and how did you decide on the dimensions for the shovel probes?
Yes, well, the shovel probe standard, you know, about 35 centimeters. On the bluff tops, we didn't go deep because Mike's work had revealed that if you go deep, what you get into is till, and we found that out as well. So, you know, you don't have to go below 40. And also, we weren't doing mitigation. In other words, this area isn't going to be destroyed. So we were interested in finding sites. So we kept it at 40 centimeters, based on Mike's work as well. So in the floodplain, that was a different matter. In some areas, we found sites right at the top, so we stopped shovel testing. And if we dug there, then we dug deeper to determine if there's anything. But in all cases, we ended up finding till in shallow areas, and in the same for deep areas, except we'd find overbank deposition. So in floodplains, we would go deeper. We found this very site at, we found artifacts at 100 centimeters. When we excavated, we found them a little higher. We covered a larger area, but we had to shovel down 100 centimeters. That was rough.
Oh yeah, that is a deep shovel test.
Yes, I had one guy who could really do it.
Let's see. Besides bison bone, were there any other types of bones that were found at these sites? I think you maybe mentioned fish or something too.
Yeah, there's an occasional fish. The Buffalo River is not a place you go for fish. Small mammals, little bits here and there. You'd be surprised at how few non-bison bones are present in these sites, especially, but except for that one woodland site. Now we did float, and we occasionally found, smaller bones in flotation as well as screening, but they're just not there. I mean, except in very restricted sites. Now, occasionally, like Mike found some bird bones on his upland site, so they're there. If you dig enough at a site, you'll find some remains, but truly, it is bison hunting.
Oh, a follow-up question to some of you work there. What would you like to see as the next step for the Science Center complex as it relates to your investigation?
I'd like to spend more time in the floodplains to dig the sites. When we were shovel testing, a student came up to me and said, "I found a bone bed." And I said, "You found what?" And so I went over there, and truly, it was all bison bone. The entire shovel test was nothing but bison bone. We had problems digging there because the university was doing a land transfer, and so we never got a chance to dig there. So that's what we'd want to dig I would want to dig is the bison processing and or kill sites. And to work on this, one more thing is to work on this notion of winter occupation in the floodplain. It's still poorly developed. Archaeologists talk about it a lot. There are very few of them that have been demonstrated, I think, to everyone's satisfaction. So that would be another neat thing. And again, it's in the floodplain.
Oh, I wanted to add in a comment that Mike was able to add during the presentation, that he is maybe not aware of any large-scale bison kill sites in the Red River region, and that supports the idea of smaller groups of people moving into the Red River region for modest hunts and sort of that pattern of use that you were discussing.
Yeah, we don't have any bison kill sites. Like I said, I do want to look at a site that has a lot of bison bones, but that may just be processing, not necessarily a kill site. I don't think Minnesota has a good one, except I think, what is the one further south in the Minnesota River? Mike, what's the name of that? Mike would know. I forget the name of the site. Anyway, that's probably a bison kill site, but there are very few of them, which is surprising because bison are important. And then Mike's right, small groups. And again, if you imagine that, and it's been hypothesized that Oneota peoples would have seasonal hunts out into the plains. We don't have any evidence for that, and we don't have any evidence for very large groups working in concert to hunt bison. You think those camps would be rather large.
People came in with the answer to your bison kill site question. Granite Falls.
Granite Falls. Oh yes, thank you. It is interesting. Every time Oneota archaeologists get together, they always say, well, there's bison hunting, and they would go in groups out to the prairie and plains to hunt bison. And my answer is always, wait a minute, there's already people living out there. Are they invited? Or how come they're coming out there and we don't have any evidence for them out there? I think that's I think people are so influenced by the historic record and when horses were available to transport people great distances. I'm not sure that that was so common in the past, especially during the late pre-contact times, when they're already the valley is chock full of people, especially in the Red River Valley.
There's a couple more inquiries sort of focused on like how you reach conclusions about seasonal use of a site. So what kind of things help you understand that, and just what indications do you look for to help you figure out when a site is occupied seasonally?
Well, with bison hunting, fetal bison are a good sign of late winter, early spring. You know, you expect if you have turtles and fish, that's probably not winter, that sort of thing. You know, we do have turtles at those that woodland sites I mentioned. I forgot to mention turtles. You know, when you find, especially out here where winters mean something, that no one's getting turtles in wintertime. And so, you know, you can work on these seasonal indicators with faunal remains if you find enough in the way of faunal remains to work at that. Seasonality is always a hard thing for archaeologists to work at. You know, as people, I've inferred that some of these winter sites, because they're in the bottoms and they, you know, have some evidence for burned bone and other burning activity, that they may very well be winter sites. But we haven't found, you know, the fetal bison or other, you know, indications that might be winter. It's a big problem, and it's an important problem that we have to solve. One indication, people have used bison teeth and, you know, to work on that, because, you know, if you get immature bison or young bison, you might be able to work at how old they might have been and what season it might have been. That's another indicator. There are a few indicators that are around that have been tried out by archaeologists.
Piggybacking on maybe winter site occupation, did you mention at all if you're aware if the Lake Bronson area is seasonal occupation, or if that example was more year-round occupation?
No, I think there is no such thing as deep sedentism in the Red River Valley. In other words, people living in one area for years on end. There is seasonal movement, and I think that's what the key. And so the idea of sedentism just has to be sort of, you have to think of it as seasonal sedentism, and where people are moving about. So even at mound sites, I don't think people are living year round. And those are the visible sites that have a lot of occupation, and probably indications, at least from, for example, Slininger Mound, where there's good evidence for feasting, of having such a diverse array of animal remains, that, you know, these are different sorts of activities. And I didn't have a chance to go into feasting and the like and the role of the mounds, because that's a, you know, I can't do everything.
This might fall in the category of trying to do a little too much here, but a question on if looking for bison kill sites, would you go about using the same sorts of survey techniques that you had used, or would you take a different approach if that was your goal?
No, I think shovel tests, you know, and a few units, you could figure that out rather quickly, I think. Because of course, if it's a bison kill site, you'd expect to find different kinds of cuts of the bison, the skeletal elements of the bison. Normally, when we dig these sites that are processing sites, we don't find the entire skeleton. We only find pieces, parts, so to speak, or select parts, choice cuts that are hauled away from the kill site. So if you find a kill site, you expect to find more of the, you know, all of the parts of the bison skeleton there. And that could be done rather quickly, I think.
I think that might have been the last question I had that came through.
Good.
We'll see if any more kind of trickle in as we wrap up, but I just want to make sure I say thank you again so much for joining us this evening, George. This was a fantastic presentation, really well done and very fascinating.
I thank you for having me.